friends, welcome to Homegrown Florida. I'm Katrina, and if you have ever grown Seminole pumpkins, which is a staple crop down here in the South, then you probably have known that it is super productive, and sometimes you kind of get sick of it and you have to figure out a way to preserve it in a way that you could eat it later. My Seminole pumpkins this last year produced an abundant amount of pumpkins. I grew it up my palm tree and it did so well. But we don't eat pumpkins all that often. I think they're technically a winter squash, but we don't eat them all that often. So we ate through as much as we have, but now we're getting towards them being a year old. And I had to figure out ways to preserve the pumpkins in fun and exciting ways that I know that we will use later. So we're doing 3 different types of preservation methods. One of them is freezing, one of them is canning, and the last one is freeze drying or dehydrating.
As much as I would love to puree these up and make them into basically pumpkin puree and then can them, there is no safe recipe for canning pumpkin puree. There is a safe recipe for canning pumpkin, and the way that you do it is you have to pressure can it, and the pumpkin must be cubed in like 1-inch dice. There's something about the consistency of pumpkin puree, I think because it is so thick that it has difficulty reaching the proper temperatures to kill off any, bad stuff like botulism in the center. But when you cube it, that means that there's water around the cubes and it can, penetrate the cubes better than a thick puree. So I think that's the reason. I don't understand all of the reasons behind everything that comes with preserving and canning. But I think that you're pretty safe to follow the National Center for Home Food Preservation. That's what I do. And they recommend the 1-inch dice with the boiling hot water. So that's the way I'm going to follow. They also recommend that by pressure canning, not water bath canning. Because this is a low acid food, winter pumpkins don't have a lot of acid to them. They're very neutral. They want you to pressure can them. For pints, it's 55 minutes. For quarts, it's 90 minutes. I'm using today my Presto electric pressure canner. I want to be real specific here and say that this is a canner designed for canning. This is not an Instapot that I'm using to can with. It's actually discouraged by the National Center for Home Food Preservation, as well as many other folks have warned others, don't pressure can inside your Instapots. It's not the same machine. This machine actually doesn't cook inside of it. All that it does is canning. It has no other purpose other than pressure canning. It does do some water bath canning, but honestly, I just find it's easier to water bath can on the stove than to set up the machine and everything. So when you see my Presto electric pressure canner, don't get that confused with a Instapot. It's not the same thing. If you're interested in my pressure canner, you can definitely go down to my Amazon store, or my description has my Amazon store in it, and you can get one yourself. It is amazing, especially for new canners who are a little overwhelmed or scared, to try out a pressure canner, like a cooktop pressure canner. I've done it both ways, and I just like the electric pressure canner because it is so hands-off. Like, I can literally go to the grocery store, go shopping, or go work in the garden, or be taking care of chores around the house, and that thing can be canning, and I don't have to worry about it. That's kind of my thing. I like that. I like multitasking. I like having tools that can do jobs for me, that I don't have to sit there and monitor it on the stove and make sure that it's maintaining the proper temperature. The hardest part about this recipe, I think, was peeling the squash. Because you're putting it in as a raw pack, it's a raw vegetable. You don't want to keep the skin on, and the skin comes off pretty easy when you cook these vegetables, but uncooked, man, it was hard. And I was using this old peeler, and then finally I kind of got smart later on in the video and got out my what I call my my tough industrial peeler, and it did so much better. But here I am dicing up the squash. I'm going with just 2 because honestly I don't know if we really like our pumpkin this way. So whenever I'm trying out new recipes with veggies, I don't make the full recipe. The full recipe might call for like 16 quarts. Like, what if we don't like it and now we have 16 quarts of this stuff? I don't want that. So I always reduce down the recipe to make sure that it's just a handful of the items. Like today we're making 2 pint-sized jars of the canned squash. I'm doing just a quart of frozen puree, and then we're also doing 1 quart of freeze-dried squash. So I just do small amounts to see which way we like better, and then we can expand on it later. This pumpkin here is a year old, and I'm going to be extending its life by at least 2 more years. Basically, the USDA encourages people to use their home canned foods within 18 months, but honestly, that's just for like taste and nutrition. The food in the jars are safe for much longer. I mean, I have stuff that's on the shelf that's 5 years old and it's still very good. When I open it, it still tastes pretty good. And it might have lost some of its nutritional value, but it's still safe. As long as your seal is still good and you used proper canning recipes and follow those recipes, you are safe, and they are going to be good. When we're ready to use this pumpkin, we'll open up the jar, we'll drain out the juice, and then I'm going to use like a potato masher to mash it up. Now, this has gone through a pressure canner for 55 minutes for the pints, so it cooks the pumpkin while it's in the jar in the pressure canner. So when I pull these out, they should be soft. If they're not completely soft, it would probably be helpful to put them on the stove and let them cook for a little bit, but I don't even think it's going to take that. I haven't opened these up yet to see, but anything that I've ever pressure canned always ends up kind of soft later on. So I'm not worried about that, and I think that you could probably just mash them coming straight out of the jar. Or you could put them in a blender, maybe add, your spices, maybe some cream, and then run them through the blender until they're completely smooth. Because while Seminole pumpkins are great pumpkins for pumpkin puree, I think, they do have a little bit of like that stringiness that you don't want in a pumpkin puree. But I have found that if you run it through a blender, that takes out most of that stringiness, and then you end up with that nice smooth pumpkin puree. I am adding a little bit of salt. I normally don't do this. Honestly, guys, whenever I can, even if the recipe calls for salt, I don't generally do it because I like to salt my food after it's canned, like when we're cooking with it, rather than adding salt to everything. But I was just trying to follow the recipe perfectly. Since it's my first time canning pumpkin, I didn't really want to stray too far from the pack here. And now that I think about it, I think there's also a really fun way to use this where you can drain it off and lay it out on a cookie sheet and roast it in a really hot oven, like 425 for 15 to 20 minutes. And I bet you can get the outside of the pumpkin kind of crisp and the inside kind of soft. I think like a potato, but with a sweetness, almost like a sweet potato. I think that's going to be pretty phenomenal. I'm really excited to try all these different ways of using these pumpkins besides just having fresh pumpkins. And here they are coming out of the canner. My 2 little jars. It looks so funny. It's just 2. I'm used to canning a lot more, but they sealed properly. They look great. They actually look really cute on the canning shelf, so I'm excited for those. We're on to our next recipe, and in this one we are going to puree some pumpkin to freeze it into little packets. I didn't mention this earlier, but I have a really hard time getting through winter squash. And so my husband showed me this trick because he kept having to come out and do this for me. So he was like, oh, here's a really easy way to do it for those of us who are not quite as strong or who, doesn't have somebody else around to help us. I have like this cleaver. It's mainly designed for like cutting through bone and stuff like that, for chickens and that kind of thing. So what I do is I kind of smack it into the pumpkin, and then I have my meat tenderizer that I have wrapped a towel around. And I wrap the towel around because when you're going metal to metal, I'm doing the meat cleaver to the meat tenderizer, it's metal on metal, and it could damage one or the other, and I don't really want to damage either one of these products. So wrapping a towel around it kind of thick gives it a little bit of cushion. You could also use like a rubber mallet to do this. It works so well. I honestly have no problems now getting through like really hard vegetables like these winter squashes. I just smack that cleaver on there, and then I just start hitting it with my mallet, and it just goes straight all the way through, and it makes it a lot easier. It's a little bit more safe of a situation as well because your hands aren't down there trying to hold this round shape while you're trying to cut through it, which is rather difficult. This is where I kind of smartened up. I got all the seeds out. You could totally do things with this pulp and this seed. I just composted it because I'm not really a huge fan of Seminole pumpkin seeds. But if you do like them, this is where you could separate the seeds from that pulp there, and you could roast them, toss them in some like everything seasoning, or like onion powder and garlic powder, and roast them in an oven. I think you want to roast it kind of low and slow, like think 350 for like 15-20 minutes. Toss them, and then you could get some really nice seeds. And you could do all different kinds of flavor. You could go with a sweet flavor as well as a savory. But I don't really do that because I don't particularly like these types of pumpkin seeds. I like the pumpkin seeds of bigger pumpkins. The next step we're going to do for this pumpkin puree is I am going to roast these pumpkins. Now I roast all winter squashes and pumpkins the exact same way. I put them face down on a baking sheet for about 400 or 425. The bigger the pumpkin, the higher the temperature. So I would do 425 on bigger ones. These guys are small, so I'm just going to do 400 and just do them 15 or 20 minutes. Funny little point here, guys. I accidentally walked away from this without setting a timer. So you're probably going to laugh at me because when I come back to them, they have burnt. But I saved the day here because of the way that I do them with them face down. The inside of them were fine. The outside were burnt to a crisp, but the inside still tasted really well. Warning here, I let them cool for like an hour before I messed with them, because it was basically that burnt part is the sugars from the pumpkin burning off, and it's basically like hot burning sugar lava. So do not touch them when they first come out. Just take them out of the oven and let them sit for a little while, and let that temperature come down. I'm saving you some pain later on. But mine, I know they look awful. I tasted them though. The inside does not taste burnt at all. Yeah, this happens. This happens to the best of us. It happens to everyone. We all burn stuff on occasion. Thankfully, I did not ruin the recipe because the pumpkin were face down, so the inside was cooked perfectly. In fact, it was like soft and beautiful and silky. I thought, oh, well, maybe I have to burn my pumpkins more often. Then I'm going to put them on my blender here. I started by just blending the puree, but it just was so thick. It really had taken all the moisture out of the pumpkins in the oven, so I needed to add a little bit of moisture back. I was kind of hesitant about this one because I'm not used to like freezing milk, because this is going to go in the freezer. But I know people that do it. People freeze milk, they freeze cream, they freeze butter all the time, so I'm like, I'm going to give it a shot. So I just add a little splash. It was just enough so that I could blend it. I also added some flavoring, so pumpkin pie spice, or you could just do your own, which would be like allspice and cinnamon and nutmeg and those kinds of things, or you can just do a pumpkin pie spice blend. And then we're just going to blend that up until it's completely creamy. You're going to let this go for 2, 3, 4 minutes. You really want that cream to be incorporated, as well as you just want to blend it further to get down the stringiness that sometimes Seminole pumpkin can have. Now I got a little quart-sized bag here, and I'm going to pour all of my pumpkin puree into that quart-sized bag. It's still pretty thick even with adding the liquid, so it was kind of a little bit difficult to get it out. Look at it. It barely wants to move out of that thing. I think it's going to be great. I'm really excited to try this. I have had frozen pumpkin puree before, and honestly I could never tell a difference. I wish I would have done more, because I'm literally shocked with how little pumpkin puree this creates from those 2 pumpkins. But I guess it takes even more. But now I have an idea of what I can use lots of pumpkins for, because it didn't hardly take any space up in my fridge or my freezer, honestly. So I'm pouring it into the bag, and after I've got it all poured into the bag, I'm going to flatten it out and get all the air out. And then I'm going to take a chopstick and I'm going to make like little indents. I'm making the indents so that when it's frozen, I can make a break point. So this is about 1 cup, or no, it's 2 cups, a quart. Yeah, I think it's 2 cups. And so this is going to be like half cup servings. Our last recipe for the day for our Seminole pumpkins is going to be a freeze-dried pumpkin. And you can use a dehydrator. I know that not everyone has a freeze dryer. They are quite expensive, but if you have been interested in getting one, they are by far my absolute favorite way to preserve food. And the main reason why is because the flavor and the texture of the food is so close in resemblance to fresh that it is way, way, way better quality. The nutrition, I mean, it maintains over 90% of the nutrition in the food. And like when you eat it, it tastes like the regular food. I absolutely adore freeze drying. Now, dehydrating, also a great choice. Doesn't maintain as much of the nutrition, and obviously the texture becomes quite different. In this particular situation, I don't think that it is as big of a deal. You are going to get two different textures, right? In a freeze-dried texture, it's like a crispy chip. And in a dehydrator, it's kind of like a chewy, think like dehydrated apples that are kind of chewy, fruit leather is chewy, or beef jerky is kind of chewy. You're going to get that kind of texture. So the texture is a little bit different, crisp versus chewy. But I think the flavors are on point, regardless of whether you do this freeze drying or whether you do this dehydrating. So all you have to do here is we're going to chop it in half, take out all of the pulp and the seeds like we have before. This is where I got out my heavy industrial peeler, and that worked so much better. And I got it all completely peeled. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut this into strips. You could dice it as well. It's whatever shape you want. And I'm going to blanch this for about 2 or 3 minutes. Now, I think if you're, I think dehydrating or freeze drying, I would blanch them. It's for the taste, not necessarily for, keeping it long term. Eating raw pumpkin just feels weird to me. Like, I think you totally can do it. It just feels odd to me. So I think blanching it kind of softened it a little bit. It brought out a little bit more of its sweetness. It just had an overall better texture and better taste. You could cook them all the way through. I'm just not 100% sure how they would hold up to the dehydrating or freeze drying process being completely cooked all the way through. Also, for me, I wanted something that I could put into recipes later. It's not just a snack. It could be just a snack, but I like more versatile options. So I wanted to freeze dry it in the blanched stage so that way if I want to use these later, I can rehydrate them and then I can put them on a tray and I could roast them, or I could chop them up and put them in some stuffing for Christmas or Thanksgiving. There was just a lot more options by blanching them and then processing them rather than cook them completely and then processing. I hope that makes sense. I did add 2 seasonings to this, which now thinking back, I'm like, maybe that wasn't the best idea. I think dehydrating it probably would have turned out better, but with freeze drying, it got weird. So let me back up. The seasonings that I used, I went with a pumpkin pie spice. I'm definitely going with Thanksgiving here. I miss the holidays this time of year. I want to go back to them. So I'm definitely cooking in that way. We've had like 2 Thanksgiving dinners in the last month. But I put pumpkin pie spice and then I put salt. And normally that should be fine, but you can't really put sugars into a freeze dryer because sugar just doesn't freeze dry very well. It's one thing that they recommend not to do honeys and not to do heavy sugars, not to do jams or jellies that have high sugar content. Dehydrating, you absolutely can do that. And I think that this little snack would have been better dehydrated in the way that I was kind of going for, which was I wanted to make like a sweet, salty snack. But I can't put sugar on it or maple syrup or anything like that on it for the freeze dryer, but you can do that for the dehydrator. So it might have been a better little snack in the dehydrator than the freeze dryer. But the pumpkin pie spice was nice on the squash, but the salt was just like, it was almost too much. It didn't bring out that sweet and salty flavor. It just kind of brought out Thanksgiving and salt. So next time I'll probably just do the pumpkin pie spice flavoring without the salt, or maybe I will shake it in some brown sugar when it comes out of the freeze dryer. I don't know. Those with freeze drying experiences, I would love to know like how you handle stuff like this where you're trying to make a snack that is a sweet snack and you want to add a sweetener on top of it, because that's something I definitely need to learn. Here's where I'm pulling it out to after it's been blanched, and I'm just going to run cool water on it to kind of stop the cooking process before it moves on to the preservation process. The freeze drying process is pretty straightforward. You're just going to leave it on its recommended settings, its default settings. You're going to put it in the freeze dryer. I did not freeze mine in advance, but lots of people do that where they'll freeze their trays beforehand. I didn't really notice much of a difference. I think that this is a fruit or vegetable that is very low in a water content, so it's not something that took a long time to freeze dry. I think it was like maybe 22 hours or something like that. But I put them on the trays and I stuck them in my freeze dryer at those default settings. I did a single layer. You're going to see here that it is a very thin layer. I could have definitely like double or tripled up, but I was running out of pumpkin and I just wanted to try it. This is one of those times when if I would have made too much, and I didn't particularly like all the salt on it, I would feel like we're being super wasteful. So I'm glad I went with a small amount, and my trays were pretty light, which meant that they freeze dried much faster. For a dehydrator, I would definitely do something like 120, 130 degrees for about 24 hours. I almost dehydrate everything for 24 hours. I just think it's easier. You're going to get that crispness, and just keep checking on it. Make sure it doesn't, burn. Make sure that, all of the liquid has been brought out of the fruit before you take it out, and then you're going to want to seal it up. Sealing it up is different depending on whether you're doing freeze drying or you're doing dehydrating. For dehydrating, you're going to want to put it in like a glass jar, and you're going to want to put a desiccant packet. I can't ever say that word. It's just like a dry packet to bring moisture out of the air. That's particularly important here in our southern region where we get a lot of humidity. Things don't hold up as long. But if they are dried well and you're using the packets, they will last at room temperature for at least a year, if not a little bit longer. For freeze drying, though, on the other hand, you can get a lot longer. So I put these in a glass jar, and then I put an oxygen absorber in them, and then I used my vacuum sealer, my jar vacuum sealer, to take out as much oxygen as possible and seal the jar tightly. And they will keep like this for years and years and years. And if you went one step further and used a Mylar bag and sealed the Mylar bag with an oxygen absorber in it, they can last like 30 years. It's pretty wild how long things last in the freeze drying world. It's one of the reasons why we got a freeze dryer. The nutrition is one, the length of how long these things last is another, and then of course the freeze drying process makes everything very lightweight, so that means that we can take it like when we're camping and stuff like that, and it works out really well for us. Doesn't take up a lot of space.
Let's try one because I'm very curious what these taste like. All I put was a little bit of salt and pumpkin pie spice. Oh, those are lovely. It's a mild taste. It's not like super sweet like a fruit would be, like these berries or these bananas. It's a nice little healthy snack. Thanks so much for hanging out with me today as we got all of our Seminole pumpkins processed into something that we can use later and keep on the shelf or in the freezer for another year. If you're curious how to grow Seminole pumpkins in your area, make sure to pick up my ebook down in the description or at homegrownfloridagarden.com. Thanks so much for hanging out with me today, guys. Happy gardening and happy preserving.